Charlie.
And I'm Nat.
And today we are bringing to you a public live Q&A session on the topic of anxiety. During the current climate, mental health has really started to come into the forefront, and we as an organisation have decided to give the wider community the opportunity to gain some invaluable insight into the world of mental health. What that means for us is that today we are here to answer any and all of your burning questions, but today with a particular emphasis on anxiety. What we want to start to do is to create a really nice open forum where we can feel safe to ask some questions, ideally if there's any insight that you want to gain, or to put some comments in so that perhaps we can start to pick it up and give each of the people watching some invaluable insights. Before we get on to that though, I think it's important that we say who we are. The first thing to note, we're not academics. I wish, but one day we are not medically trained. What we are individuals with lived experience who have our own personal experiences of going through the issues that we like to discuss at length with you guys. What that means is that we've got kind of a unique insight, if you will, into the world of mental health as people who have been through it, tried and tested. And what we want to do today is to give you guys perhaps a bit of a different angle and an invaluable kind of different perspective perhaps on how you can start to empower yourselves to get out of issues if you do have them. So with regards to our roles, I am a wellbeing program coordinator here, and that means that part of my role is being in charge of the creative side and the content, but also what I spend a lot of my working day doing is working on the front lines with our members day in, day out, to start to help them to recognise their issues and how they can start to make meaningful transformation with regards to that.
And I'm a wellbeing coach here, and I do everything from assessments to workshops and to our foundation course as well, right through to the community, and work with members on a daily basis. That's my main job.
That's it. Thank you very much, Nat. So with regards to today, you are in perfectly safe hands. You've got people that are tried and tested and really know this subject inside and out. So what we're going to do now is we're going to start to crack on with the live itself. We do have some preloaded questions to start to guide the narrative a little bit, but a reminder, if there's anything that you want to bring, any thoughts, just fire away. We'll pick up on them. That's the plan. So should we have a look at our first question today? Ooh. What came first, your struggles in managing your fear or your mental well-being issues? So I really like these kind of questions, because for me it's I don't know about yourself, Matt, but it's a chicken and egg question.
Oh, it's so difficult, isn't it? And when we do this in the workshops, it's very difficult to be able to pick, and everyone's got their own journey into it as well, so there's no right or wrong answer. It's just very good to highlight sometimes what came first, that's all.
That's it. I think when we can start to do a little bit of reflection with the value of hindsight, what we're going to start to do is to paint a picture of just quite how important anxiety or fear, as we can feel it sometimes, is to keeping us locked into our issues. I know that for myself, on a personal level, I was always quite a worried child. I think that's probably a little bit of a theme that we might start to see with people that have to manage anxiety as well. It's nothing that I was able to put on a label on when I was younger, but that worry started to snowball for me at one point in my life, particularly when I went to university when I was 18 years old. There was a whole change of scenery. I was put into a new environment where suddenly I was given a lot of free rein to make my own choices. And quite frankly, the amount of choices that I had an opportunity overwhelmed me. I think it's fair to say that before things really got to a head for me 3 or 4 years ago, the fear was really something that started to snowball me down into that place. So initially, a fear of seeing people, a fear of speaking to my friends, a fear of joining, all the different things that we had at university. And progressively, what that fear did for me meant that I was isolating more, meant that I wasn't doing as many things as I used to. And over the course of a few years, I started to restrict what it is that I was doing, to the point where eventually I started to develop a huge array of other symptoms as well. What about for yourself, Nat?
I suppose I'm a little bit like you. I think I was always an anxious person. My anxiety probably came to a head when my parents split up. And that's when I had OCD tendencies already before. And I could probably trace it back to when I was about 8 years old. But then my parents split up when I was 10. And my granddad had a very serious heart attack. And one of my family friends died as well, all in the space of a short time. The anxiety was completely exasperated, and this came out in an OCD and me controlling the aspects of my life that I could control, whereas loads of stuff was out of my control.
that makes total sense. So I think what we'll find is that for a lot of us, we might have already had some tendencies for a while. It doesn't have to be the full-blown panic attacks, it doesn't have to be full-blown anxiety, but what we'll find is that in life there might be some triggering events.
Yeah,
ultimately. Then that can start to lead us down that slippery slope where OCD takes over, potentially in your case, and find itself general anxiety, certainly social anxieties as well. And then we can find ourselves dropping into so many of the other mental health issues. You know, depression is hugely linked with anxiety, for instance. The second that we start feeling anxious, our gut instinct is to stop doing the things that we used to love. We start to disconnect. We're not living lives suddenly which have any kind of real meaning to us. And consequently, low mood.
Absolutely.
But it has far bigger reaches than just depression as well. And what we'll start to find is that actually this whole web is interlinked.
Yeah, definitely.
Certainly is. So I can see that we've got a comment. Hi everyone, thank you for your patience. And I do want to just pick up on that one very quickly. Of course, you were expecting us at 12 o'clock today. We had a few technical difficulties, so thank you for your patience around that. Should we have a look at the next question now?
Yeah.
Perfect. So, what are some of your triggers into anxiety?
Oh, crikey, it's a big one, isn't it?
It's a big question. I think for anybody that's watching, you're probably going to recognize that actually there are a whole host of different triggers into anxiety. Do you mind sharing a couple of your?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, one thing that I've discovered, I suppose, with the OCD is that anything can trigger it off. Anything, including leaving the house. But it's mainly when I'm feeling out of control or stress is a massive trigger for me. So if I'm stressed out and I feel overwhelmed and I feel like I'm not in control of a situation or several situations, I will then revert back to my OCD tendencies because that way I'm controlling everything.
So for you, it's a control thing.
Definitely a control thing, yeah.
Yeah, that makes an awful lot of sense. No, not just knowing you as an individual, Nat, but it makes an awful lot of sense because relating it to myself as well, and I'm sure we'll be able to recognize this in ourselves, but uncertainty, a lack of control over the future, what it is that it might hold.
Huge one, uncertainty and not being able to second guess the future, isn't it?
Yeah.
Absolutely. And you've just got to kind of relinquish it, and it's easier said than done, isn't it, sometimes?
Yeah. That's it. And I think that it's interesting you mentioned that, but anxiety can really stem from us wanting to have control of the future as well.
Massively.
And a huge bit of work needs to be done around that, and really with OCD as well, as being able to recognize that we have to relinquish that control.
Definitely.
I think there are so many different triggers that people can find that happen to anxiety. And for me, if I'm talking quite broadly, I've always kind of categorized it into two kind of types of triggers that you can have. There's fear of the unknown, which is the uncertainty of the future, wanting to have some control around that. But there is also the fear of repeated mistakes as well.
Gotcha.
It can be that as we go through our life, we pick up all these different experiences. And what we'll find is that when we're put into a situation that's quite similar, perhaps to where we've had a past failing, we can find ourselves going into that anxiety state as well. I know that if I'm talking for myself, again, really social anxiety was a huge thing. So any kind of social situation, I used to have these huge expectations that for me to be okay socially, I would need to be the life of the party. I would need to be the center of everything. Everyone would need to be laughing and joking with me. And sometimes that expectation of having to try and reach that meant that I wasn't feeling secure in myself. I was feeling anxious. But more so than that as well, they start to interfere in huge aspects of our lives. And I'm hoping that nobody watching this would have guessed it, but I used to have a gigantic fear of public speaking. Absolutely huge fear, not just on social platforms, but I got to the point where I wasn't comfortable talking to groups of more than 4 people or so, just because of the things that happened to me in the past. I'm sure we'll talk about that at some point as well. I think the thing that we want to be taking from this, though, is that our triggers into anxiety can be numerous. There's probably going to be a huge variety of them, but actually anything can be a trigger.
Anything could be a trigger. I was just going to ask you, actually, that when you talk about the university, I think it's quite a big one, actually. Any change in circumstances that you're not necessarily prepared for can cause that anxiety. And for me personally, when I went to university as well, people don't actually talk about the fact that you are taken out of your comfort zone completely. And you're given all these options that you don't really know what the answer is, do you? And it can be overwhelming. And I just wondered, like, because when you said that 4 people, that's very specific. What were you feeling at the time when, I don't know, you went to a social gathering that was more than 4 people?
So I was feeling all of the different symptoms that you start to get with anxiety. There was a huge amount of overthinking, really staying locked into my own brain as well. But the main kind of motor, the driving force, if you want, when I was in those situations is I just wanted to get out.
Okay.
And my whole focus was always on how can I just get through the next 10 minutes, 30 minutes, get to a point where I can make a reasonable excuse to leave, and then take myself back into my comfort zone, which at that time was just my bedroom. Is where it was. And I found myself in kind of a pattern because it was, it's very hard to not come across groups of 4 or less people. I would find myself in a pattern where I was just living in this tiny little bubble.
Yeah.
Occasionally I would be forced to leave that bubble. I would go to that place. I would manage my anxiety symptoms as much as I could, and then I'd just bounce back. And it very much felt almost like it was a lot of the time in this little bubble here, and then out, back, out, back, out, back.
And essentially not enjoying any of it. So you did what you had to do.
Yeah.
And a lot of us fall into that, don't we? That, we know sometimes that we have to go to the shop to get food, but then return to our comfort zone as quickly as possible. And that's not enjoying life, is it?
No, that's it. And I think that's then the greater consequence, isn't it? If we're not managing our anxiety, we're not going to be able to access the things that we know we want to do.
Yeah.
We have all these expectations about where it is that we want to be in life, and the more that we don't match that, then that starts to lead to so many other issues. I won't go into it, but yeah.
Managing expectations is a big one with you, isn't it?
It is. On a personal note, yes. Thank
you,
Nat. You know me well. It's very true. There's just one final story that I actually want to share when we're looking at triggers, and I really want this just to highlight how varied triggers can be. And this is a story that I read in a book called The Happiness Trap by Russ Harris, and it was talking about a gentleman that had been in Vietnam. He'd been in the war. He was a US soldier, and he'd witnessed some truly, truly horrendous things while he was out there. Eventually, his tour ended. He went back to the US, and strangely enough, he was fined for a great many years until one day he woke up. And from that day, every time that he woke up, he would find himself in a really, really panicked state, really, really highly anxious. He went through years of different therapies trying to understand exactly what it was, until eventually he was asked to consider the different things he had in his environment at home. And what he worked out is that his trigger into anxiety was the shampoo brand that his wife had started to use. Without knowing it, she had changed her shampoo to something that had been out there in Vietnam, and it was the smell of her using it in her hair every morning.
It's amazing,
that then triggered him into anxiety.
Yeah.
So even a smell can be a trigger. Absolutely anything. I can see that we've got a comment. Hello, Jeffrey. It's very nice to have you. If there's anything that you want to bring to the table today, please, of course, do send in a message. Should we have a look at the next one, Nat?
Yeah.
Very nice. So the next question. Ooh, how can you tell when you're feeling anxious?
Crikey, another big one, isn't it? Because it is different for every single person.
It is. And this is something that I've come across before, is that some people haven't been able to tell that they've been anxious until they've started to recognize some of the really common symptoms in themselves. I've got a really easy one to point out. I sweat. That's what I do. And I mean, it's a hot room right now, but there's a little bit of sweating that's going on because this is still a new kind of experience for me.
Yeah.
But it's not just sweating. Kind of breathing faster, hyperventilating can happen. Do you get a faster heartbeat as well?
Absolutely. I mean, I've had panic attacks, as you know, that have resulted in me going to A&E because I thought I actually was having a heart attack, because it's a very, very real physical symptom, isn't it? And I phoned 111, trying to be logical, trying to get my heart rate down. I kind of knew that it was panic attack, but I was having the pain in my chest and down my arm. So instantly, when you say to 111, I've got pain in my arm and my chest, they say, you need to go to A&E, you need to go and get checked out. So I did, and everything, all the tests, I had ECG, X-ray, everything came back fine. And then I knew that I'd created it really in my own head. But saying that, it still felt absolutely real.
That's it. It's the way it can take over the whole body as well. Do you know, I've just had a realization myself. when I was at university again as well, I used to have this pain that I thought was my heart, and it was kind of always there. I knew it wasn't a heart attack because I'd have been dead a long time before, after 3 months of having felt this pain. And eventually I also went for tests, and they did x-rays, etc. And I can't remember what they termed it in the end, but they basically came back with the verdict of, we have no idea what's wrong. Everything is absolutely fine. We'll put it down as undiagnosed lung pain, I think is what they went for in the end. I was like, brilliant. That's not particularly helpful.
What do I do with that information?
What do I do with that information? Nothing is what I did with that information. But sure enough, actually, in the years after that, after having worked on it, I don't have that pain anymore.
Exactly.
Psychosomatic.
Absolutely. I think one of the symptoms that I didn't realise, and probably most of my 20s still didn't realise, was that my anxiety came out in different ways. So I knew of the symptoms, I knew of the physical symptoms, but in terms of me being short-tempered or snapping, or because I don't consider myself an angry person, I don't really think I've got a temper. But then at heightened times of anxiety or stress, I would appear as if I had a temper. And really what it was doing was covering my anxiety. I was anxious about something in my own head. I'd built it up, and it was coming out like I was snapping at other people, close people around me. And that took me a long time to realise that that was masking my anxiety.
Yeah, so I think what we're going to start to see as well is that anxiety really underpins a great deal of stress.
Yeah.
And I think we can all start to relate to times when we felt stressed, and like perhaps much like yourself as well, Nat, it starts to change our personality a little bit.
Definitely.
Yeah, we can find ourselves getting short-tempered, angry, not necessarily in the right places as well.
Yeah.
We can start to take it out on those around us. Yeah, if I relate that to my experience as well, hugely anxious, and that started to transfer itself as my anger towards society. I had a huge global anger that I felt hugely let down by all the services, by all the people in my life, and it made me a very not nice person to be around. Let's just put it that way. But good, that's a really interesting symptom as well that we don't necessarily always touch on.
No, it's hidden, isn't it? I think sometimes with physical symptoms, they're the more obvious. You know when you're sweating, you know when your heart rate's picking up, you know when you've got shaky legs or you can't get your words out, you've got a dry mouth, and it's some of the ones that underpin it that you've got to tackle in the long run. Does that make sense?
It makes sense.
Yeah.
It makes sense. That's right. Just to name you guys a few other kind of triggers that we can, or not triggers, sorry, symptoms to so how it is that we can know that we're feeling anxious. We can start to have stiff legs, shaky legs. We can start to feel a little bit numb. I know a lot of people can start to feel nauseous as well. It's actually starting to feel a little bit ill. But more so than that as well, there's an element of focus. So this is the interesting thing, and depending on who you speak to, some people say they lose focus. They start to zone out a little bit. They can't take anything in. And then some other people have the opposite, which is hyperfocus, which is when they get almost like tunnel vision, and all they can see is exactly the problem, what it is that they're focusing on, to the exclusion of everything else. But it's hugely varied.
I get that with spiders.
You do? Tunnel vision?
Yeah, absolutely. I can focus on it, so I could walk into any room and tell you if there was a spider in it. It's almost like I'm on absolute high alert, and I can pick it out. It's very, very strange thing. My partner always says to me, how on earth did you see it up there in that corner? And I just will notice, because I've got a fear of spiders. So obviously my body thinks I'm in danger.
That makes total sense. And I'm going to assume we're in a clear room right now. Good. We're spider free right now.
Otherwise I'd be gone.
Brilliant. So should we have a little look at the next question? And whilst the next question loads up, I just want to draw attention to the comments. We've got Janice, who says, hi there, hope you're well. Thank you, Janice.
Hi,
Very
Janice.
well. Hope you're well as well. And we've got Adele as well. Very nice to have you on, Adele. Nice to meet you. So what does that say now?
I can relate feeling like I need to run or fight. Is it okay to have these urges?
I think the bottom line to this answer immediately has to be yes.
Yeah, of course.
So to give you guys a little bit of science, and I promise I'm not going to go too deep into it, but fear, anxiety, exists primarily to protect us. It is something that the vast majority of people are going to share, and fear actually at its basis serves to protect us from danger. If there is a threat in the room, if there is an urgency that we need to have, anxiety starts to take over to try and to make us deal with that threat as fast as we can. I mean, we can just draw this back. Imagine that we were all cavemen right now. We would feel anxiety if there was a scary beastie that came over the brow of the hill. But we would also feel a little bit scared or anxious if we were running out of food. And in both of these situations, anxiety would actually motivate us and give us the energy that we need to be able to make those changes around us to protect us, and it's usually linked to survival. So relating that to that, anxiety tends to give us one of 4 different responses, is what it will do. And we might have heard of some of these. We call them the 4 F's here at Isorropia, but we're talking about, of course, fight, which sounds like what you used to do now, if you don't mind me saying, a little bit of aggression.
Sometimes, yeah.
Whether that's verbal.
Didn't actually fight.
I'm sure. You've actually told me you've never been involved in a fight, and we'll keep that going. But fighting, whether that's physical or verbal, just being nasty to people. We have flight, of course, which is when we have that urge to run away. And that can be a really, really helpful thing as well. We have freeze, which is a whole different one. And this is one where rather than fight or run, we stay exactly where it is that we are. We might get brain freeze. We might start to go numb, pale. It's really hard for us to focus and to get anything out. We might struggle to talk. And we also have fawn, which is a slightly less recognized one, but I think it's an important one that we start to look at, because fawning is a complicated word that basically means we're complying with the threat.
Yeah.
So the way that we can see this a lot in people with anxiety, people pleasing.
Yeah.
It's easier to say yes to something that someone's asking rather than actually create potential conflict further down the line. But also over apologizing is another way that kind of starts to show itself as well. I know I'm sure that a few people who are watching this might recognize that in themselves as well. I think the thing that I want us to recognize is that actually all 4 of those are particularly useful in some situations. Again, if there was a scary beastie that came into the room right now, I think we'd want to run.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
On the other hand, if there was a particularly vicious chihuahua that came at me, I'd probably fight it. And that would actually be to try and protect myself.
I'd hope you wouldn't, but yeah. Well.
There's a chance that I would get that urge. But all of it is there to try and help us to get through that threat or danger.
Yeah.
So it makes total sense. And to have these urges doesn't make you strange. It doesn't make you weird. It makes you human.
Yeah.
That's what it does.
And most people will figure of 8 through all 4 of those F's, won't they? They won't just stick in one. It depends on the situation a lot for people and what the anxiety is about.
Exactly. Dependent on the situation, you might get different urges. I was a flighter. That's what I was. I would avoid all of these anxiety situations at all costs, staying in my comfort zone, avoidance coming in as well. But they're going to be different from person to person.
Definitely.
Should we have a look at the next question?
Yeah.
Lovely. We have, what are some of the past experiences that have left you with anxiety? I like this question because this starts to really highlight the way that perhaps sometimes the past situations we've been in can start to give us anxiety. I'm going to give you a very basic analogy right now, but for the vast majority of us, we don't start off with inherent fears around everything in our lives.
No.
Usually it's something that's actually developed through the experiences that we have. So to give you guys an analogy, imagine a young child. They don't know any better. There's a hot stove on in the kitchen. They're kind of curious, they're playful, they see that it's red. They reach out, they touch it, they burn themselves. In that moment, that child right there has had an experience which has taught them an invaluable lesson.
Yeah.
Don't touch hot stoves. But if we don't start to understand that situation better, what can actually happen is that child is then scared of that stove regardless of when it's on or off. So what we'll start to find is that as we go through life, we pick up these experiences and they start to shape the way that we're going to have anxieties around things around us. So do you have any examples for yourself of past experiences?
I've got a really strange one, actually.
I like strange.
This I probably didn't find out that this even happened. So I can't remember this experience, but I grew up thinking that seeds in peppers, just normal peppers, were poisonous. So when I was well, 18, 19, I'd left home and I was cooking. I was very obsessive with removing all the seeds from the peppers. And in fact, I would avoid using peppers as often as I could because I thought the seeds were poisonous. Now, I had a conversation when I came home with my dad about this. And he said, when you were about 2 or 3, you were sat on a chair next to me prepping dinner. And I turned round and looked back and I thought you'd eaten some of the pepper. And he was worried that it was going to upset my stomach. So his reaction must have been, oh my God, what have you got in your mouth? Like, spit it out, blah, blah, blah. And I'd carried that through. I cannot remember it happening. How odd is that? You can't even remember the past experience that's caused your anxiety.
It's true. I think that's a really, really important thing to say. That's a particular one, isn't it, for you and
Very
peppers?
particular.
Yeah. So I'm not going to go into great detail about this because I don't remember why, but I have a fear of cardboard. I don't share that very often.
Cardboard?
Yeah.
It's very specific.
Touching cardboard. I can look at cardboard, but I don't touch it. One day I might understand that, but this is all from things that have happened either in our memory or sometimes out of them as well. I love the pepper story because sometimes we don't necessarily recognize where our fears stem from. But I've got a couple of examples that I know really started to affect me greatly into the future. So I've mentioned that I used to have a huge fear around social situations, and it was only a few years ago that I started to manage to piece together exactly why that was. And I've got a short story to tell you guys about a time when I was doing a piece of coursework in English GCSE. It was year 10, and for this piece of coursework, all of us were asked to do a presentation. So it wasn't a presentation, we were asked to do a debate in front of the class. I was young, I was confident, I was cocky, and I was certainly naive. And what I decided to do as a bit of a joke and a laugh is that my topic that I was going to debate in front of the class was bacon. Just that one word, bacon. I knew nothing about debating. All I knew about bacon is that I really liked the taste of it and I had it for breakfast most mornings. And what that meant for me is that in the run up to the debate, I did absolutely no preparation. Besides one thing where I started to make these tiny, tiny little badges that said, I love bacon on them. And sure enough, 5 minutes before the presentation or the debate starts, I'm going out and I'm handing them out confidently to everybody who's my classmates who are going to be there in the audience. I'm
sure they were great badges, to be fair.
They were wonderful badges.
Exactly.
That's where I poured my efforts into. But one thing I hadn't taken into account was that I wasn't going to be able to choose my debating partner. And the teacher that I was with at the minute, she chose the most strong-headed vegetarian out of that entire classroom. She brought her to the front and we started the debate. And as you can imagine, I don't know anything. She knows a whole lot on the subject. Within 2 minutes, she is wiping the floor with me. I've got nothing left to say. Freeze starts to set in. I go pale. I stop being able to talk. I feel numb. I'm zoning out. And thankfully, I'm quite grateful for this. I had a teacher that picked up on that. And she said, stop, Charlie, go back to your seat. I did go back to my seat and I kind of hung my head in shame. But from that moment, that single experience, I felt so many emotions in that moment, so much shame, so much fear and guilt, that meant that from that moment onwards, every time there was an opportunity to do any form of public speaking, that was off the cards. I tried that once. I was never going to do that again. And it really, really affected me into the future. I think what we'll find is that each of us will have had experiences which sometimes they can teach us valuable lessons. Don't touch a hot stove, a valuable lesson. But sometimes they can actually teach us to be afraid of things that ultimately we might want to be able to do in our lives, but also don't really stand to harm us.
And also, I think something that you've highlighted with that story is your reflection process after wouldn't have been great because you felt all of those emotions at once and you probably didn't pick them apart. And then what you did was store it and carry that around with you, instead of what we do now, which we do on a daily basis, is reflect and say what went well, what didn't go so well, and what will I do differently next time. And the most important thing after asking ourselves those 3 questions is to then let it go. You know, there's no point in carrying some of this stuff with us. Does that make sense?
It makes total sense. And you're right. I think at that age, and a lot of us won't have that awareness to be able to do that reflection. What I could have made it mean was, Charlie, you're okay. you didn't do any preparation, you couldn't account for your debating partner, you might have not done the best debate, but
and you had brilliant badges.
And I made brilliant badges, for instance. Some of them were brilliant badges, and I know for next time I'm just going to do a little bit more preparation. But what I made it mean for myself in that moment is, Charlie, you're an absolute failure. You cannot do public speaking. To stand up in front of people is going to lead to more shame and embarrassment. The lessons that I took from that moment were detrimental.
Yeah.
Because I didn't have that ability to reflect and to put things where it is that they needed to be.
And then it links into your self-confidence and self-esteem, because as you said, what you made it mean was that sometimes we can catastrophize about stuff, can't we? So what you've made it mean is that you aren't probably intelligent, you're not good at doing this, that you were worthless to a certain degree. And that's not rational. That's not rational thinking. But all of that would have been going through your brain, and that's what you've taken from it, and that's what you've taken forward into your future.
And I love that you mentioned that. The knock on the self-esteem, that sense of self-worth and self-respect, can then start to give us, if we're lacking it, it can start to give us anxiety, and not just those specific situations, but all round.
Yeah.
If I'm carrying feelings of, Charlie, I'm a failure, I'm not going to feel comfortable doing a whole host of things.
Yeah.
Not just speaking in front of people.
It just leaks out, doesn't it, into every area of our life, especially if we feel unworthy.
Absolutely. And I think that's probably the biggest trait that I see amongst people that struggle with their mental health, is a lot of us have the same commonality, that we struggle with our self-esteem. We struggle with that sense of self-worth. And this is where the web starts to come together, doesn't it? And all of that picture starts to get painted. I think that a lot of us are going to recognize, perhaps consciously or unconsciously, some of the things that might have given us anxiety, but there is a strong lesson that we do need to take from this. Because things have happened one way in the past, it doesn't mean it's going to happen the same way going forward. And we need to be mindful of when we're projecting the past onto the future.
Definitely.
Yeah.
I mean, we're not talking about like trauma here, because obviously that's just a whole different bag. And only 1 in 5 people who experience a traumatic event actually get like PTSD. So it's a very acute issue. We're talking about the experiences, like Charlie said, that we're letting seep into our self-confidence, our esteem, and then our ability to tackle the same situation or similar situations in the future.
That's right. I'm glad you mentioned PTSD. I think that is something that we should draw a little bit of attention to as well. So PTSD is something that is very closely linked to a part of our brain called the amygdala. I'm not going to bore you too much with the whole science around this, but the thing that's important to recognize is that if we do experience really traumatic events in our lives, the kinds that do give us PTSD, that actually starts to make a slight biological imprint on that part of the brain. What that means for people who are struggling with PTSD is that if they come across anything that was present, that was there at the time of their initial trauma,
like the shampoo,
exactly, that is PTSD. You then get flooded with all of those same feelings and emotions that you had at the time of the initial trauma. Again, the brain is actually trying to be helpful. It's trying to say, damn, that was a really bad experience, get yourself out of there, feel those same things and get yourself clear. But unfortunately, that can then start to affect other areas of our lives as well. With regards to PTSD, there are plenty of things that anybody can start to actively do to be able to manage that and to make some really strong improvements around that. The first thing that I'm going to highlight, of course, is therapy. We can talk about EMDR, which is a desensitization therapy. We can talk a lot about rewind therapy as well, which is a kind of a new hip one that I quite like, which is similar to EMDR in that it desensitizes you to the past as well.
There's lots of options.
There are lots of options, but ultimately another form of therapy is proven to work quite well, and that's exposure therapy. And that's giving your brain the ability to recondition itself to those triggers, but in a really safe manner. So it is important to seek professional help.
Definitely.
I would say, if you're recognizing any of that in yourself.
Yeah.
All right. Next
question.
Very nice. We have, how can I tell if my thinking is giving me anxiety? So I like this question because it's already starting to draw perhaps on a few of the different ways that we can make ourselves feel anxious. You mentioned OCD quite early on, and OCD is very, very relevant to yourself and perhaps to a few other people watching this video as well. And we're already going to start to recognize the role that our thoughts can play in making us feeling anxious. There is a beautiful thing about the human mind, and the human mind has something that is potentially quite potent and quite powerful. We have the ability to engage in abstract thinking. Abstract thinking is a wonderful, wonderful thing. It means that we can start to picture things which don't exist. It's the reason that we've got skyscrapers. No one knew what a skyscraper was until someday somebody had that picture in their mind and they made that a reality. It's the reason that we managed to get to space, but it's also the reason that we can imagine scary monsters under the bed. They don't exist. The tricky thing is that our minds, our brains, they cannot tell the difference between what is real and what is just going on in our heads. I think with regards to our thoughts, the way that we can start to know if our thinking is giving us anxiety is if we're in a safe environment, so we're not actually facing a threat directly then, and we're starting to feel anxious. It can be because our mind is starting to look at the future and start to consider different outcomes of how things might go. If we're recognizing that in our own minds we are focusing wholly on a negative outcome, picturing the worst case scenario, not taking any of the positives that are going on, for instance, what we're going to find is that's like a real experience for ourselves, and then we'll get flooded with all those symptoms as well.
If you go back to what I said about having that panic attack, I mean, that was a classic case of it, where I'd recently lost a job because the pub that I was working in shut down. It's a really difficult time on the Isle of Wight to get a job in November. I went for, I think, about 50 jobs until I eventually went, right, I can't get any of these jobs. I'm going to have to go on universal credit, go on the dole for the first time. And I did all this. And one of my friends who lives in Australia, his mum had a heart attack. And that was playing on my mind an awful lot. And I was just sat watching TV, literally in my own home, having a cup of tea, and it just came out of nowhere. Literally what I thought was out of nowhere, what I thought. So I wasn't in any danger. In fact, I was in probably the safest place I could be. There was no actual threat going on in my life in terms of real threat, apart from the upset. And that led to me being in A&E for 5.5 hours waiting for test results. And it wasn't until I went back and looked at it and I said, right, okay, so it was like a whole accumulation of what was going on in my life. It was almost like a month and a half of all these things happening and me not processing them properly. So somewhere I'd shut them off and I'd bottled them up until they resulted in me having a panic attack.
That makes an awful lot of sense. And it's interesting, your story as well. It parallels one that I heard from a colleague of mine, I think it was a couple of years ago, who was sharing that they hadn't had much experience with anxiety or panic attacks until one day it became a reality when they were living on the mainland. The story that they shared is that a friend had told them a secret. And this colleague that we have held the secret inside of them, and they felt a whole lot of guilt about wanting to tell somebody the secret because it really impacted them in a massive way. Then there would have been that breach of trust if they had done so. This colleague, very similarly to yourself, kind of carried that for a few months until eventually, I think it was 3 months for this person. They'd got overwhelmed. And suddenly all of that pent-up fight and flight, all of that pent-up adrenaline burst out into what became a full-blown panic attack. If anybody here has experienced a panic attack before, I know that we both have and quite a few people have, biologically what's actually happening is that we are building up all of our fight and flight response. If over a period of time we're getting all of this anxiety, all of this stress, and we're not managing to process it, like you said, or actually just expend the energy, what we'll find is that doesn't necessarily go anywhere. It stays in our system till eventually it's like uncorking a champagne bottle. So it's like there's so much pressure and all of it is used up at the same time. And that's when we might do the really heavy breathing, lose focus, feel like we're getting chest pains, for instance. And that's what's going on there. Of course, it can be a slow build up over time, but also it can happen just in the moment as well. If anyone has ever, we hear stories of people that see truly horrible things happen, and they will have a panic attack or go into shock there in the moment, which is very similarly related as well. We have a question. I wake up suddenly most nights. Is this anxiety?
Oh, this is an interesting one, because I would probably say it depends how you wake up. However, when I was younger, I used to have night terrors. So I'd get up. I've even hit my mum in one of my night terrors, and I'd look awake and be talking. It'd be absolute nonsense, but I'd be almost hyperventilating as well. So whatever was going on was anxiety. And I went to a therapist about it, and she explained it as I was building up all my anxiety in the day. So I was ignoring it, shutting it off, emotional bottling, all of the above. And when I was getting to a state in my sleep where my body was almost relaxing, that's when it came out. So it was in that REM stage, and I would have a night terror. So I'm wondering if that could be the case here. The only thing there's two things that I did that helped me, which was one, I had a meditation tape at the time. That's going back a bit. I had a meditation tape that I could put on quickly in the middle of the night to get me into a calm state. And secondly, I've had problems since, even though they haven't come out in night terrors, when I've been really stressed, I've been thinking about a lot of things. I used to keep at times like this, would keep a pad and pen by my table, bedside table. So I'd wake up and I'd just scribble what I was worried about. And for some reason, getting it out of my head and onto the paper meant that I could then go back to sleep.
That's a really good technique for managing it. Really, really good. I mean, it's tricky when it comes to sleep, isn't it?
Yeah.
And certainly where we are, again, not medical professionals, wouldn't be able to kind of diagnose necessarily anything like that. But the role that anxiety plays in affecting our sleep can be absolutely huge. Like you say for yourself, that was a beautiful explanation of the way the night terrors work. Beautiful. But we can also start to find that sometimes being busy in our own minds means that we struggle to get to sleep. Sometimes when we wake up, we might still be having these anxious thoughts. And sleep is its own topic, and actually we will be approaching this in the coming weeks as well. But sleep is paramount to our mental well-being. Is what it is. If you are recognizing that you are struggling with your sleep in particular, and you feel that you've given it your best shot at working on your anxiety, you feel that you've given it your best shot at working on your sleep hygiene as well, then it is really, really important to talk to a professional.
Definitely.
In fact, it's so important that one of the first things that they might treat if you ever find yourself in 7 Acres, which is the acute mental health ward on the Isle of Wight, one of the first things that occasionally they will treat is sleep, because it's that central to how we feel. So hopefully, I think you've done a very good job of answering that.
I hope so.
I hope so. Good.
I will try that. Thanks. Oh, brilliant. I'm glad that helped. Any more questions, just send them, and I'll try and answer them as best as I can.
That's brilliant.
And Natasha's put, I will try that. Sounds a good idea. Good.
Brilliant. Thank you. It's nice to get some good feedback on that. But you're certainly writing out. Get it out of your head as much as you can. Get it out of your head. Brilliant. Shall we have?
Next
He's
question.
on it.
He's on it.
Very nice.
I feel overwhelmed with so many anxieties, and it feels too much to tackle. How can I start battling them?
Right. So this is where we're getting into the meat, isn't it?
It is, really.
So we've taken a little bit of time to understand anxiety, the way it affects us, and why it is that we might have it. But if it's such a big problem, what can we do now to start getting through that? So it's bothering us less.
It's highly debated, this one, isn't it? Because up until recently, people said that if you had loads of anxieties, you should tackle the biggest one first. Now, what they're saying, well, some theorists, and you take whatever stance you want on it. We're just throwing ideas out, and hopefully something will stick with you and something will work with you. But what they're now saying is if you tackle all the smaller anxieties, then what you're actually doing is reducing the biggest anxieties. So if, for example, your biggest anxiety is to go, say, to the pub and be around a lot of strangers, but your smaller anxieties, because you suffer social anxiety, is to go to the shop or go to the park or get on public transport. What they're saying now is if you tackle the smaller ones, like going to the shop, going to the park, getting on public transport, by the time you get to your biggest anxiety, which is maybe a social gathering at the pub with family and friends or strangers, your anxiety will automatically have been reduced by doing the smaller things.
I think that's a really good way of looking at it. And also the pride and validation that you're going to get from actually tackling those smaller ones first will just better prepare you for the big one.
Definitely.
So I'm inclined to think with your style that if you make a hierarchy of your anxieties and you start from the bottom up, that's probably the best and safest way to start to approach it. There are a few things I think that everybody wants to bear in mind. So I think what anybody who's wanting to tackle their anxiety should do is to, like say, make a list of their anxieties, but we want to rank them. I've got a good system that's worked for me for ranking them. We want to consider which anxieties affect us frequently. If it's something that happens on a day-to-day basis or happens several times a day, that's a pretty big anxiety, I would say, and that's something that is probably going to want to feature on our list. If it doesn't happen frequently, but it happens, when it does happen, it happens with severity, it's really, really strong. That's something we're going to want to give consideration to as well. But this is the biggest for me, as far as I'm concerned. Recognizing that anxieties can act as a block from us getting the lives that we want to be getting. We also want to consider anxieties that stop us from achieving our life goals.
Definitely.
And there's a nice little analogy that I like to give with this one. If I'm a local fisherman and I have a fear of flying, I probably don't need to tackle that because I'm quite happy on my boat. I'm quite happy doing my fishing. That's enough. But if I have aspirations of being an international businessman, I'm probably going to want to work on my fear of flying because that fear right there is going to stop me from leading a life which has meaning to me. Yeah. So good. We're going to start with that. We're going to start from the bottom up. So let's take this a little bit further now.
Go on.
Let's say that one of my low level fears is going to the shops. Let's say that this is the case for me. What would you probably recommend for me in that first instance, now that I know that that's the one I want to work on?
I mean, you guys have probably heard of flooding before. Flooding is possibly the best technique. However, we do say that it is best to do it with a therapist, isn't it, or someone else?
With support,
just in case, you get overwhelmed in that situation, because then it would be taking 10 steps back, wouldn't it? But another way of doing flooding that you can do by yourself is graded exposure. So I don't know if you guys have heard graded exposure. I've done it before on one of the Facebook lives, actually. And so, for example, if it is going to the shop, you would, for the first day, you would just go to your front door, you would open your door, you would make sure that your anxiety levels are reduced, then shut the door, go back and sit in your comfort zone with a cup of tea on the sofa.
Bit of a reward.
And then there's no time limit. I must stress this. There's no time limit to do this, because the most important thing is to get your anxiety levels down. So if you were going to the door and you were still anxious, some people would only have to do it for a week. Some people might have to do it for 3 weeks. It's important to get that anxiety down before you move on to the next stage. And the next stage might be that you step out of your front door, go back in the house, and just break it down into small steps. So go to the end of your garden, back into the thing. Then choose kind of times of the day. I know it sounds really simple, but plan the times of your day where you're going to go to that shop. And a lot of people do this on public transport, don't they?
Choose quiet times.
Quiet times to build it up. And we're not saying don't go at busy times in the end, but it's important, as I say again, to get the anxiety down and not to feel overwhelmed, because then you're kind of setting yourself up to fail there. You just need to break it down, be really kind to yourself as well, and just break it down into steps.
That's it. I think you've really hit on the golden one as far as I'm concerned. Lots of different ways that we can start to manage anxiety. The jury is out. But the one that has probably proven the most time and time again is we need to expose ourselves to the things that make us anxious, but again, in a safe and measured way. If we consider just for a moment, a bit like yourself and Peppers, right? Myself and public speaking, we have these anxieties that have come to us from past experiences, and the only way that we're going to reteach ourselves that we don't need to be anxious around them is actually to give ourselves positive experiences where we don't feel hurt, ashamed, anxious. And then it starts to rewrite that own internal story. Of course, exposure is going to be the fastest way that we can possibly do this. But like you say, just gentle steps. This does need to come with a disclaimer, as far as I'm concerned. Just because if you are going into an anxious situation, you are planning an exposure exercise, if you leave that situation while you're still feeling anxious, still feeling really anxious, it's actually going to have the opposite effect. It is going to reconfirm to you that that is a thing to be scared of. So it's really important to note that if you do decide to take some steps outside of your comfort zone, make these changes, do not leave that situation until you are feeling calmer and more relaxed. Otherwise it's damaging.
And it is each to their own, really. I mean, I've actually been doing graded exposure with spiders.
You have?
I have. And this all started with the house that I was living in before I've just moved, had a courtyard, and there was a big spider out there. And I went outside and I thought, I'm going to just go straight back in. And I thought, no, I need to be around it. I was the other side of the courtyard, right? But I thought I'll be around it until I can get my heart rate down. So it took about, let's say, 10, 15 minutes to get my heart rate down. And I did this every time the spider lived here. And I named it as well because it made it easier. And what I tried to do each time was just get a little bit closer, and that's because that's what was working for me. I know some people who go and literally hold a spider. That would not work for me. That would tip me over the edge. And then I do what Charlie just said, which is come away being more anxious and not having that good experience from it. So I would be just as scared, if not more scared, of spiders. So there's no point in me doing it. I need to break it down so that I can be in the same room without a reaction. And I have got better. So it's been, I haven't been doing it very long, but even my partner said to me the other day, because when we were in London, a spider fell on my face.
Oh God.
Out of a lamp. And he'd never seen me like this before. And I like to think that even though I have an OCD, I'm quite a logical, down-to-earth person. And I completely lost it. That's it. There was tears, there was screaming, there was everything. All of this, like you said, about the fear, flight, all of it.
At the same time.
All of it at the same time. Yeah. I was just a complete mess. So I know it sounds silly to some people about spiders, but it's a long journey for me. And if I can be in the same room as one without having that reaction, that's good enough for me.
Well, that's your goal. And like you said, it doesn't matter how long you're going to be taking to get to this journey. If you're moving forward, you're moving forward.
Exactly.
That's all there is to it. Small, manageable steps. You did mention flooding. That's the first thing you mentioned when we started to talk about exposure. And I just want to kind of give it a little bit of reassurance that this can be a good thing. Again, I used to have a fear of public speaking. I've clearly got over that, clearly. And the way that I managed to get over that was actually not initially out of choice. I used to work at White Karting down at the go-kart track and ride. I'm not promoting them, although they are lovely. And when I was working there, I still had these huge social fears. One day, the health and safety briefer was ill, wasn't able to come into work. And that meant that as an organization, we had to find somebody to go and do a little presentation to a group of 10 people or so, to then be able to explain how the track works, what they're allowed to do, what they're not allowed to do.
So more than 4 people?
More than 4 people, yes. I was the oldest, is what I was, who was there, and I was picked and I was thrown into this environment, and my anxiety was absolutely huge when I first went into that. Sweating, all of the symptoms kind of going on. But what I discovered is that over the course of that day, as I had to do it repeatedly, every 10 minutes, new group, I started to relax. I started to feel all right in it, and eventually I started to enjoy it when I realized that I could just spin my own little narrative and tell a joke here and there.
And what a success as well.
Yeah, what a success. So flooding can work, but it's always important to do that as safely as you can. I can see that we've had a few comments come in. Should we have a little read?
Yeah, let's have a read of those.
So I'm just going to do a little bit of scrolling in the meantime. We have Tim says, using Charlie's example, it helped me greatly to go out at night when no one else was around and gradually go out earlier and earlier. So eventually I'd get out just before shops were shutting.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
Perfect.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
As I would like to take credit for that. I think that was you, Nat. But that's absolutely brilliant. There's proof in the pudding. If we can take those gentle steps, it really starts to help. The next comment as well. I try to do a group a week, but put myself amongst people each week, as if I don't, I find it difficult all over. I guess that's consistent exposure. That certainly is. Just to validate that, absolutely. I do feel that helps me. If I don't, those anxieties return in full force.
Yeah.
Just to validate yourself, Natasha, you're absolutely doing what we're discussing right here.
Yeah.
If you know that you've got social anxieties, to start to gently and consistently, I love that word, self-discipline, keep going. It will get easier in time. And I know that you put this in the comment that you will feel better week on week. I think that's the really, really important thing to note here as well. So I think that we're probably going to end on this question because it's such an in-depth one, is what I feel. But I think it's also important that we talk about perhaps some things that we can do to manage anxiety in the moment.
Yeah.
So let's say that we've planned our exposure exercise. What can we do while we're doing that to help us feel okay as we're going through that process as well?
Yeah.
So there are a few tried and tested techniques that we can use. We can start to look at grounding techniques.
Yeah.
So for those of you that aren't aware, a grounding technique is any technique that we do to take our focus off of our minds to reconnect us with the present moment. We can start to potentially start to focus on things that we can see. What is it that I can hear? What is it that I can feel? And if we're able to bring our attention into the body, that actually helps to start to move through.
Yeah, it's good to, and also because a massive one for anxiety is jumping ahead, isn't it, into the future. It helps you focus on the here and now, so it's very mindful and it's very grounding. And I actually read somewhere the other day that you don't necessarily have to be able to see, hear, smell, taste or touch anything. You can imagine your favorite tastes, your favorite smells, your favorite scenery like a forest or the beach or something like that. So if this happens in the middle of the night, this is why I was researching it. If it happens in the middle of the night, you can ground yourself without having to see any of these things, and it will still have the same effect because your brain is still thinking of that and that alone. So it's being mindful, if that makes sense to everyone.
It makes total sense. And mindfulness practice ties in so closely with grounding. Anything that we can do to take our attention off of those thoughts to reconnect what's going on around us. As you mentioned, imagining taste, I got the taste of maple syrup. I did just a second ago. So it does work. It does work. There are plenty of other things that we can do as well. Meditation, once thought of as a hippy-dippy concept, no more. I can tell you that for a fact. In fact, there is amazing science which actually backs the use of meditation and the way it starts to make biological changes in the brain as well. It will better brace us not just for anxiety, but for a whole host of really strong emotions that we can feel, allowing us to observe them, to move through them rather than to get caught up and swept up by them as well.
And I think it's really important to say as well, meditation looks differently for everyone, doesn't it? It doesn't have to be, you know, and this is from personal experience, I thought it meant, you know, sitting cross-legged on the floor chanting or whatever, and it doesn't have to be like that. I mean, one of my favorite things is I will listen to OK Computer by Radiohead all the way through, and I just get into a zone where all I'm listening to is the music, so there's no thought. It's about emptying the thoughts from your mind, really, isn't it? And that's the main thing, having a clear mind and being in a relaxed state. But however you do that is entirely up to you. Like, that's the point of it. There's no right or wrong way to meditate, is there?
That's true. There is no right or wrong way, and it can be clearing your mind, but it doesn't have to be that either. It can just be becoming an observer. Sometimes we take, that's it, exactly. Yeah. Sometimes we can identify with our thoughts so strongly that we get caught up in them. The practice of meditation helps us to realize where we end and our thoughts begin.
Yeah.
And we are not our thoughts, fundamentally. Yeah. Thoughts will happen, but it doesn't mean that it's an accurate representation of what's going on. There are loads and loads of other techniques that we could talk about, but I'm poignantly aware that we are coming up to time. So just before we end, I want to thank you all for coming, number one, but also I want to recap a little bit of what we've talked about today. So hopefully today we felt that we've got a little bit of an understanding as to the origins of our anxiety and the way that our anxiety can start to affect us. And we've started to open up our minds perhaps to some of the things that we might be able to do to start to make some really meaningful and active changes around that, so that we're not left with the anxieties that we might have now, but there is hope for a future where we're less affected by them. And of course, the proof's in the pudding. You're talking to two people who have done this work inside and out for themselves, but also the evidence is all around us, and that is exemplified best by none other than our members that we are very lucky to have with us as well. So on that note, I'm going to thank you for coming. It's been a pleasure hosting you. And what I will say, if there's anything that you've kind of felt has been brought up from there and you're not a member of our service, then please don't hesitate to seek a referral to us, where we'll be able to do some really good hands-on work with yourselves as well. On that note, it has been a pleasure.
Thank you so much, guys.
And we will see you guys another day.
See you later.
Take care.